Hello everyone, welcome to Kerala PSC HSA English classes. This is Sri Lakshmi here. As per the syllabus, we are next moving on to the terms and movements based on the latest edition of M.H. Abrams, a glossary of literary terms. The neoclassic period in England spans the 140 years or so after the Restoration, and the Romantic period is usually taken to extend approximately from the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 or alternatively from the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798. With reference to American literature, the term neoclassic is rarely applied to 18th century writers. On the other hand, 1830 to 1865, the era of Emerson, Thoreau, Poe, Melville, and Hawthorne, is sometimes called the American Romantic period. Neoclassic and Romantic are frequently applied also to periods of German, French, and other continental literatures, but with differences in the historical spans they identify. Historians have often tried to define neoclassicism or romanticism as though each term denoted an essential feature which was shared to varying degrees by all the major writings of an age. Classicism is not much explained in the glossary of literary terms, but neoclassicism and romanticism is being explained in very detail. The following list of ideas and characteristics that were shared between the 1660 and the late 1700s by authors such as John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Joseph Addison, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson, Oliver Goldsmith, and Edmund Burke, may serve as an introductory sketch of most prominent features of neoclassic literature. So this is page number 236 of the book. It will be better if you go through the book. I am just giving an overview of all these literary terms. It's a rapid session. So these neoclassical authors exhibited a strong traditionalism which was often joined to a distrust of radical innovation and was evidenced above all in their great respect for classical writers, that is, the writers of ancient Greece and Rome, who were thought to have achieved excellence and established the enduring models in all the major literary genres. The term classic has come to be applied to any later literary work that is widely agreed to have achieved excellence and to have set a standard in its kind. Second feature of neoclassicism is that literature was conceived to be primarily an art, that is, a set of skills which, although it requires innate talents, must be perfected by long study and practice and consist mainly in the deliberate adaptation of known and tested means to the achievement of foreseen ends upon the audience of readers. The representative neoclassic writer commonly strove, therefore, for correctness, was careful to observe the complex demands of the stylistic decorum, and for the most part respected the established rules of this art. The neoclassic rules of poetry were, in theory, the essential properties of the various genres such as epic, tragedy, comedy, pastoral, that have been abstracted from classical works whose long survival has proved their excellence. And coming to the third feature of neoclassicism is that human beings, and especially human beings as an integral part of a social organization, were regarded as a primary subject matter of the major forms of literature. And by the human actions it imitates and the artistic form it gives to the imitation, poetry is designed to yield both instruction and pleasure to the people who read it. Not art for art's sake, but art for humanity's sake was a central ideal of neoclassic humanism. The fourth feature of neoclassicism is that in both the subject matter and appeal of art, emphasis was placed on what human beings possess in common representative characteristics and widely shared experience, thoughts, feelings, and taste. The primary aim of poetry is to give new and consummate expression to the great commonplaces of human wisdom, whose universal acceptance and durability are the best warrant of their importance and truth. The fifth feature is that the neoclassic writers, like the major philosophers of the time, viewed human beings as limited agents who ought to set themselves only accessible goals. Many of the great works of the period, satiric and didactic, attack human pride, interpreted as presumption beyond the natural limits of the species. In art, as in life, what was for the most part praised was the law of measure and the acceptance of limits upon one's freedom. The poets admired extremely the great genres of epic and tragedy, but wrote their own masterpieces in admittedly lesser and less demanding forms, such as the essay in verse and prose, the comedy of manners, and especially satire, in which they felt they had more chance to equal or surpass their classical and English predecessors. Okay, all these are the features of neoclassicism. I'm not giving the written note to you because it's not that much important. It's just mentioned in the syllabus. You just go through the definition of each movements, who are the major exponents of these movements. That's enough. I'm just giving the explanation by reading through the pages of the book too. So you have, what you have to do is that go through the book and note down each and every points that you think will be relevant for your exam. So now moving on to the romanticism, so which is on page number 238. So the first feature is that the prevailing attitude favored innovation or over traditionalism in the materials, forms, and styles of literature. Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads in 1800 was written as a poetic manifesto or statement of revolutionary aims in which he denounced the upper class subjects and the poetic diction of the preceding century and proposed to deal with materials from common life in a selection of language really used by men. It violated the neoclassic rule of decorum, which asserted that the serious genres should deal only with the momentous actions of royal or aristocratic characters in an appropriately elevated style. Other innovations in the period were the exploitation by the Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, and others of the realm of the supernatural and of the far away and the long ago, the assumptions of William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Shelley of the persona of a poet prophet who writes a visionary mode of poetry and the use of poetic symbolism deriving from a world view in which objects are charged with a significance beyond their physical qualities. The second feature is that in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth repeatedly declared that a good poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. According to this view, poetry is not primarily a mirror of men in action. On the contrary, its essential opponent is the poet's own feelings. While the process of composition, since it is spontaneous, it is opposite of the artful manipulation of means to foreseen ends stressed by the neoclassic critics. The third feature is that to a remarkable degree external nature, the landscape together with its flora and fauna became a persistent subject of poetry and was described with an accuracy and sensuous nuance unprecedented in earlier writers. It's a mistake, however, to describe the Romantic poets as simply nature poets. While many other poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and to a great extent by Shelley and Keats, set out from and return to an aspect or change of the aspect in the landscape, the outer scene is not presented for its own sake, but as a stimulus for the poet to engage in the most characteristic human activity, that of thinking. So, romantic works are in fact poems of feelingful meditation, which, although often stimulated by a natural phenomenon, are concerned with the central human experience and problems. The fourth feature is that neoclassic poetry was about other people, but many romantic poems, long and short, invited the reader to identify the protagonist with the poets themselves, either directly, as in Wordsworth's Prelude, and a number of lyric poems, or an altered but recognizable form, as in Lord Byron's Childe Harold. In prose, we find a parallel walk in the revealingly personal essays of Charles Lamb and William Hazlitt, and in a number of spiritual and intellectual autobiographies. Thomas De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, etc. So, and whether romantic subjects were the poets themselves or other people, they were no longer represented as a part of an organized society, but typically as solitary figures engaged in a long and sometimes infinitely elusive quest. Often they were also social nonconformist or outcast. And the fifth feature is that what seemed to a number of political liberals the infinite social promise of the French Revolution in the early 1790s fostered the sense in romantic writers that theirs was a great age of new beginnings and high possibilities. Many writers viewed a human being as endowed with limitless aspiration toward an infinite good envisioned by the faculty of imagination. According to a number of romantic writers, the highest art consists in an endeavor beyond finite human possibility. As a result, neoclassical satisfaction in the perfectly accomplished because limited enterprise was replaced in writers such as Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley by a preference for the glory of the imperfect, in which the artist's very failure acts as the grandeur of his aim. Also, Romantic writers once more entered into competition with their greatest predecessors in audacious long poems and the most exacting genres. For example, Wordsworth's Prelude, then, you know, it has a rendering at epic length and in form of a spiritual autobiography of central themes of John Milton's Paradise Lost. Then Blake's visionary and prophetic epics, Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, Keats' Miltonic epic Hyperion, and Byron's ironic, conspectus of contemporary European civilization, Don Juan. So that's all about neoclassicism and romanticism. Classicism is not that much discussed in the book. So we are moving on to the next topic, that is humanism. In the 16th century, the word humanist was coined to signify one who taught or wrote in the studia humanitatis or humanities, that is, grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, as distinguished from fields less concerned with the moral and imaginative aspects and activities of man, such as mathematics, natural philosophy, and theology. In the 19th century, a new word, humanism, came to be applied to a view of human nature, the general values, and the educational ideas common to many Renaissance humanists as well as to a number of later writers in the same tradition. Typically, Renaissance humanism assumed the dignity and central position of human beings in the universe, emphasized the importance in education of studying classical, imaginative, and philosophical literature, although with emphasis on its moral and practical rather than its aesthetic values, and insisted on the primacy in ordering human life of reason as opposed to the instinctual appetites and animal passions. Many humanists also stress the need in education for a rounded development of an individual's diverse powers, physical, mental, artistic, and moral, as opposed to a merely technical or specialized kind of training. So, you will get these notes about humanism on page number 161 of the book of A Glossary of Literary Terms. Then, the synthesis of classical and Christian values in the writings of, Sir Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, and John Milton led to the rise of the Christian humanism. The rapid advance in the achievements and prestige of natural sciences and technology after the Renaissance sharpened in later years of the humanistic tradition. Matthew Arnold was a notable proponent of humanism in the Victorian period, strongly defended the central role of humane studies in general education. Many of the Arnold's leading ideas are adaptations of the tenets of the older humanism. His view, for example, that culture is a perfection of our humanity proper as distinguished from our animality and consists of a harmonious expansion of all the powers which make the beauty and worth of human nature. In the last century, the American movement of 1910 to 1933, known as a New Humanism, under the leadership of Irving Babbitt and Paul Elmer Moore, argued for a return to a primarily humanistic education and for a very conservative view of moral, political, and literary values that is grounded mainly on classical literature. In most colleges, the earlier humanistic view of the aims of a liberal education survives, mainly in the requirement that all students in the liberal arts must take at least one course in the group called the humanities, which comprises literature, philosophy, music, languages, and sometimes history. It is notable that a number of structuralist and post structuralist philosophical and critical theories were extremely anti humanistic, not only in the sense that they undertook to subvert many of the values proposed by traditional humanism, but in more radical sense that they undertook to decenter or to eliminate entirely the focus of the human being or subject as a major object of study and the major agency in effecting scientific, cultural, and literary achievements. Diverse post structural and other opponents of humanism assert that human centered systems of norms and values are based on the fallacy of essentialism, that is, the view that there is an essential human nature or set of defining human features which is innate, universal, and dependent on historical and cultural differences. The linguist and social philosopher Noam Chomsky supported human essentialism on the basis of shared human capabilities, but on the basis of a biologically determined universal grammar fixed in the human brain, which enables the rule bound creativity of the production and understanding of language. A number of feminist, gay, and lesbian critics and proponents of ethnic multiculturalism are adherents of identity politics and stake out a position which differs from both the humanistic and post structural views of the nature and valid role of the human subject. Like traditional humanists, identity theorists reject the extreme post structural claims that the human subject is no more than a social construction or textual effect and reposition the subject as the particular sexual, gender specific, or ethnic identity at the center of the scene of writing, interpretation, and political action. The term identity politics is often used pejoratively to signify the subordination of objective study to political aims. So that's all about humanism. Next, we are moving on to realism. Realism is applied by literary critics in two diverse ways. One, to identify a movement in the writing of novels during the 19th century that included Henri de Balzac in France, George Eliot in England, and William Dean Howells in America. And second is to designate a recurrent mode in various eras and literary forms of representing human life and experience in nature. Realistic fiction is often opposed to romantic fiction. The romance is set to present life as we would have it be, more picturesque, fantasic, adventurous, or heroic than actuality. Realism, on the other hand, is set to represent life as it is, as it really is. So, the distinction in terms only of subject matter, while relevant, is clearly inadequate. It is more useful to identify realism in terms of the intended effect on the reader. Realistic fiction is written to give the effect that it represents life and the social world as it seems to the common reader, evoking the essence that its characters might in fact exist and that such things might well happen. To achieve such effects, a novelist we identify as realist may or may not be selective in subject matter, although most of them prefer the commonplace and the everyday represented in minute detail over rarer aspects of life. But they must render their materials in ways that make them seem their readers a very stuff of ordinary experience. You'll find all these details on page 334 of the 10th edition of M.H. Abrams, A Glossary of Literary Terms. Okay, continuing with realism. Russian formalists, followed more systematically by structuralist critics, propose that both the selection of subject matter and the techniques rendering in a realistic novel depends on their accordance with literary convention and codes, where the reader has learned to interpret or naturalize in a way that makes the text seem a reflection of everyday reality. Some theorists draw the conclusion that since all literary representations are constituted by arbitrary conventions, there is no valid grounding for holding any one kind of fiction to be more realistic than any other. It is a matter of common experience, however, that some novels in fact produce a reader the effect of representing the ordinary course of events. The next term, magic realism. Both the fictions of Franz Kafka and the present-day novels of magic realism achieve their effects in general, in large part by exploiting a realistic manner in rendering events that are in themselves fantastic, absurd, and or flatly impossible. The term magic realism originally applied in the 1920s to a school of surrealist German painters was later used to describe the prose fiction of George Luis Borges in Argentina, as well as in the works of writers such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Colombia, etc. And when Italo Calvino in Italy, and John Fowles and Salman Rushdie in England. So all these writers weave in an ever shifting pattern, a sharply etched realism in representing ordinary events and details, together with fantastic and dreamlike elements, as well as with materials derived from myth and fairy tales. An example is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. So that's all for today. There is more terms and movements to be discussed. In the next class, we'll meet again. This is a recording, okay? It's not a written class as usual, because it's not, it's just mentioned in the syllabus. Not that much important. Please note down the definitions and the main exponents of the movements. That's enough. That's why I'm giving a recorded session of the class. Hope you will like it. Please give your suggestions on the comment box. Thank you. Have a nice day.